The autumn wind swept across the rolling hills of Tennessee, carrying with it the scent of dried cornstalks and the promise of an early winter. Ezra Coleman sat on the weathered porch of his grandfather's farmhouse, his calloused fingers wrapped around the neck of an old banjo that had seen better decades. The instrument's worn wood gleamed dully in the fading light of another day that had brought nothing but empty mailboxes and overdue notices. At 62, Ezra had the kind of face that told stories without words, deep lines carved by years of sun and worry, eyes the color of storm clouds, and hands that had worked the same stubborn soil for most of his life. The Coleman farm had been in his family for 4 generations, but now it felt more like a weight around his neck than a legacy to preserve. "Another letter from the bank today," he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible above the evening chorus of crickets. The notice lay crumpled beside his chair, its contents burned into his memory. 30 days to bring the mortgage current or face foreclosure. 30 days to find money he didn't have for a farm that barely produced enough to keep the lights on. The banjo felt familiar in his hands, like an old friend who never judged or demanded explanations. His grandfather had taught him to play on this very porch when Ezra was just 7 years old, back when the farm was thriving and the future seemed as endless as the Tennessee sky. "Music's got healing in it, boy," the old man used to say. "When words fail you, let the strings do the talking." Ezra's fingers found their way to a melody that had been haunting him for weeks, something that seemed to rise from the earth itself, full of longing and loss, but somehow beautiful in its sadness. He didn't play for audiences anymore, hadn't touched the banjo in public since his wife Sarah passed 3 years ago. She'd been the one who believed in his music, who used to sit on the porch swing and listen with tears in her eyes as he played the songs that poured from his heart. The farmhouse behind him stood silent and too large for one man. Sarah's garden had gone wild, though he couldn't bring himself to clear it. Sometimes he imagined he could still smell her cornbread baking in the kitchen, still hear her humming along to his melodies. The loneliness was a physical thing now, settling in his chest like a stone. Down the dirt road, the lights of Millbrook Township twinkled like earthbound stars. The small town had been struggling almost as long as his farm. Main Street was half empty, the young folks all moving to Nashville or Atlanta for work. Most of his neighbors had already sold out to the big agricultural corporation that was slowly swallowing up the county, one family farm at a time. But tonight something felt different. As Ezra played, the melody seemed to take on a life of its own, flowing through his fingers like water, finding its course. The banjo's voice carried across the hills with unusual clarity, each note hanging in the crisp air before blending with the next. He played for Sarah, for his grandfather, for the land that had shaped him and was now slipping away. The music told the story of seasons cycling through the fields, of hands that had planted and harvested and held loved ones close. It spoke of morning coffee shared over kitchen tables, of children's laughter echoing through barns, of the weight of tradition and the fear of being forgotten. The banjo sang of struggle and endurance, of the kind of love that outlasts the people who create it. As the moon rose full and bright, casting silver shadows across the corn stubble, Ezra lost himself completely in the music. Time seemed to slow, and for the first time in years, he felt something approaching peace. The melody flowed from some deep well inside him, bringing with it memories of better days and the faint hope that perhaps they weren't all behind him. He played until his fingers began to ache, until the last note drifted away into the darkness, like a prayer carried on the wind. When the silence returned, it felt different somehow, not empty, but full of possibility. Ezra sat back in his chair and looked up at the stars scattered across the vast Tennessee sky, the same stars his grandfather had pointed out to him all those years ago. "I played for you tonight, old man," he whispered to the darkness, "played for all of us who've called this place home." The autumn wind picked up again, rustling through the oak trees that bordered the property. In the distance, a barn owl called out, its voice lonely but strong. Ezra carefully placed the banjo in its case, not knowing that his music had traveled farther than he could have imagined, touching hearts in ways that would change everything. As he made his way inside the quiet house, the moon continued its journey across the star-filled sky, bearing witness to a moment that would soon ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. The forgotten farmer had sung his heart to the heavens, and somewhere in the darkness the universe was listening. The first light of dawn crept through Ezra's bedroom curtains like a gentle whisper, but he was already awake, staring at the ceiling where water stains had formed familiar patterns over the years. Sleep had been elusive, filled with dreams of music floating across moonlit fields, and voices calling his name from distances he couldn't measure. The banjo case sat in the corner of his room, silent now, but somehow still humming with the memory of last night's melodies. Coffee was brewing in the kitchen when he heard the first sound that would change everything, the distant rumble of engines approaching on the gravel road. Ezra frowned as he peered through the window above the sink. Nobody came out this way anymore, not unless they were lost or looking to buy his land for pennies on the dollar. But this wasn't one vehicle. It was several, creating a small dust cloud as they made their way up the long driveway. The first truck was a weathered blue Ford, its paint faded, but its engine strong. Behind it came a red pickup that had seen better days, followed by what looked like a small convoy of vehicles. Cars, trucks, even an old motorcycle bringing up the rear. Ezra's heart began to beat faster as he counted them. 7 vehicles in total, more visitors than he'd had in the past 6 months combined. He stepped onto the porch, still wearing yesterday's clothes and feeling suddenly self-conscious about the state of his property. The barn needed painting, the fence posts were leaning, and Sarah's garden looked wild and unkempt. But the approaching vehicles didn't seem deterred by the farm's worn appearance. The blue Ford pulled up first, and Ezra was surprised to see a middle-aged woman behind the wheel. She had graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wore a denim jacket over a simple white blouse. When she stepped out of the truck, her eyes were already bright with something that looked suspiciously like tears. "Mr. Coleman," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "My name is Margaret Hayes. I live over in Ridgewater, about 15 miles east of here." Ridgewater. Ezra knew the town, another small community struggling to keep its identity in the face of economic pressure. He nodded but remained on the porch, uncertain about this unexpected gathering. More doors were opening now, and people were emerging from the vehicles like flowers blooming in fast forward. An elderly man with a silver beard stepped out of the red pickup, followed by a young couple holding hands and a family with 2 small children, who immediately began exploring the yard with the fearless curiosity of youth. "We heard your music last night," Margaret continued, stepping closer to the porch. "I know that probably sounds impossible, but I was sitting on my back deck, couldn't sleep, when I heard the most beautiful banjo playing I've ever experienced. It was like the wind carried it straight to my heart." The elderly man from the red truck approached, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "Name's Robert Henley from Crossroads Valley," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "I've been playing music my whole life, Mr. Coleman, and what I heard last night, well, it reminded me why I fell in love with it in the first place." Ezra felt his throat tighten. "I don't understand. You couldn't have heard me from that far away. Sound doesn't travel like that." A younger woman stepped forward, her dark hair catching the morning sunlight. "Maybe sound doesn't," she said with a gentle smile, "but music does. I'm Elena Rodriguez from Pine Creek. I was having the worst night of my life. My mother's in the hospital, bills piling up, feeling like everything was falling apart. Then I heard this banjo playing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt hope." The young couple approached hand in hand. The man spoke first. "We're Danny and Lisa Morrison from Millbrook Township. We were driving home from the hospital. Lisa just lost her father, when we had to pull over because this music was so beautiful, it made us both cry. We followed the sound as best we could, and it led us here." More stories began to pour out as the group gathered closer to the porch. A mother spoke of how the music had calmed her colicky baby for the first time in days. A veteran described how the melodies had eased nightmares that had plagued him for years. A teenage girl shyly admitted that the banjo's voice had talked her out of making a decision she would have regretted forever. Ezra sank into his porch chair, overwhelmed by the flood of testimonies. These people had driven from 3 different towns, some as far as 20 miles away, all claiming to have been touched by his music in the darkness of the previous night. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. But even as he said it, he remembered the way the music had felt different last night, more alive, more purposeful than anything he'd played in years. Margaret reached into her truck and pulled out a cloth bag. "We didn't come empty-handed," she said, climbing the porch steps without invitation. "Folks in Ridgewater heard what happened, and they wanted to contribute something." One by one, the visitors began producing items from their vehicles. Fresh vegetables from gardens, homemade preserves, a hand-knitted scarf that smelled of lavender, a wooden box filled with honey from local hives. Robert Henley brought a bottle of homemade apple cider and a promise to help with any repair work the farm might need. The family with children presented Ezra with a painting their 8-year-old daughter had made, a crude but heartfelt depiction of a man playing banjo under a starry sky. The veteran quietly placed an envelope on the porch table, and when Ezra looked inside, he found several $100s in cash with a note that read, "For keeping the music alive." As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the Tennessee hills in shades of gold and amber, Ezra found himself surrounded by the kind of community he thought had disappeared forever. These strangers had become something more. They were witnesses to the power of music to bridge distance and heal wounds, proof that some things still mattered in a world that often felt too large and impersonal. The banjo case in his bedroom seemed to call to him, and Ezra knew with sudden certainty that last night had been only the beginning. Word spread through the 3 counties like wildfire through dry grass. By Tuesday afternoon, just 2 days after the mysterious night of music, Ezra's phone hadn't stopped ringing. The old rotary phone Sarah had insisted on keeping looked almost comical next to the modern world that was suddenly beating down his door, but its persistent ring had become the soundtrack to his bewildering new reality. Margaret Hayes had returned that morning with a reporter from the Nashville scene, a young woman named Jessica Chen, who drove a silver Honda and carried a digital recorder like it was made of gold. She sat across from Ezra at his kitchen table, her eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm he hadn't seen directed at him in decades. "Mr. Coleman, I've interviewed hundreds of musicians," Jessica said, setting her recorder between them next to Sarah's old sugar bowl, "but I've never heard stories like the ones people are telling about Sunday night. They're calling it the night the music traveled. Social media is going crazy." Ezra winced at the mention of social media. He barely understood what that meant, but Margaret had shown him some of the posts on her phone. Photos of his farm, stories about the mysterious banjo player, requests for him to perform again. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold on a screen. "I just played some songs," Ezra said quietly, his weathered hands folded on the table. "Same as I've been doing for years." "But not the same," Jessica pressed gently. "Everyone describes something different about that night. Mrs. Rodriguez from Pine Creek said the music seemed to come from the earth itself. Robert Henley claims he's never heard a banjo produce those kinds of harmonics. And the distance," she shook her head. "Acoustic experts are saying it's scientifically impossible for unamplified music to carry that far." Through the kitchen window, Ezra could see more cars parked along his property line. People had been arriving all day, some just curious, others claiming they needed to hear him play again. A few had brought their own instruments, hoping to somehow capture whatever magic had happened on Sunday night. The phone rang again, and Ezra looked at it with resignation. Margaret answered it for him, as she'd been doing for the past hour. "Coleman residence," she said in her practical way. "Yes, he's here, but no, he's not giving interviews to television stations right now." A pause. "I understand you're from Good Morning America, but the answer is still no." Jessica leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Mr. Coleman, I know this must be overwhelming, but people are saying your music saved them that night. There's a woman in Crossroads Valley who says your banjo playing prevented her from taking her own life. A man in Ridgewater claims it helped him call his estranged son for the first time in 10 years. These aren't just coincidences." Ezra felt the familiar weight settling on his chest, the same feeling he'd carried since Sarah's death, the sense that he was somehow responsible for more than he could handle. He pushed back from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the gathering crowd. "I miss my wife," he said suddenly, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "I miss the way she used to listen to me play. I miss having someone who understood why the music mattered. Sunday night I wasn't playing for anyone else. I was just remembering." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Jessica turned off her recorder, and Margaret quietly hung up the phone when it rang again. "Maybe that's why it worked," Jessica said softly. "Maybe people heard something real for once." Robert Henley's voice carried through the screen door before his knock. "Ezra, sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see." The 3 of them stepped onto the porch to find the yard transformed. What had started as a handful of visitors had grown into something resembling a small festival. Families had spread blankets on the grass, children were playing between the parked cars, and someone had set up a small table with coffee and sandwiches. But what caught Ezra's attention was the music. Danny Morrison sat on the tailgate of his truck with a guitar, playing a soft melody, while his wife Lisa hummed along. Near the old oak tree, Robert had his fiddle out and was teaching a young boy how to hold the bow properly. Elena Rodriguez was sharing a song in Spanish with a group of women who swayed with the rhythm even though they didn't understand the words. "It's like Sunday night started something," Margaret said, standing beside Ezra as they watched the impromptu gathering. "Like your music gave everyone permission to share their own." An older woman Ezra didn't recognize approached the porch with careful steps. She had silver hair braided down her back and carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd lived through hard times and emerged stronger. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "My name is Maria Santos. I drove here from Nashville when I heard the stories." She paused, emotion flickering across her weathered face. "My grandson died 6 months ago. Overdose. I haven't been able to listen to music since. It hurt too much. But Sunday night your banjoed, it was the first time I heard beauty instead of pain." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, pressing it into Ezra's hands before he could protest. "This isn't charity," she said firmly. "This is gratitude. There are a lot of broken hearts out here, Mr. Coleman, and somehow your music is helping us remember how to heal." As the afternoon wore on, more stories emerged. A veteran who hadn't slept peacefully in years, a mother whose autistic son had spoken his first words in months after hearing the distant banjo, a retired teacher who'd rediscovered her love for the piano after decades of silence. Ezra found himself sitting on his porch steps, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by something he still didn't fully understand. The banjo case sat beside him, and he could feel the weight of expectations settling around him like fog. But for the first time since Sarah's death, the weight didn't feel crushing. It felt like purpose. 3 weeks after the night that changed everything, Ezra stood in his barn as golden autumn light filtered through the weathered boards. The space had been transformed from a repository of broken farm equipment into something Sarah would have called magical. Robert Henley and a crew of volunteers had spent the better part of 2 weeks cleaning, organizing, and creating what could only be described as an intimate concert venue. Hay bales served as seating, arranged in a rough semicircle around a simple wooden platform that Danny Morrison had built from reclaimed barnwood. String lights, donated by Margaret Hayes, hung from the rafters like captured stars, casting warm pools of light that made the whole space feel sacred. The air still held the faint scent of hay and old wood, but now it was mixed with something else. Anticipation. "Feels different in here," Ezra murmured to Margaret, who was adjusting one of the borrowed microphones. The sound system was simple, just enough to ensure everyone could hear without losing the intimacy that made this place special. "Everything feels different now," Margaret replied, her practical hands making sure the cables were secure. "The whole county's talking about tonight. Nashville Public Radio wants to broadcast it live." Ezra nodded absently, his attention drawn to the banjo in his hands. It was the same instrument he'd played that first night, but somehow it seemed to have gained weight. Not physical weight, but the gravity of expectation and hope. Through the barn doors, he could see cars beginning to arrive, their headlights cutting through the early evening darkness. The guest list had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. Maria Santos had driven up from Nashville again, this time bringing her daughter and 2 other families who'd lost children to addiction. Elena Rodriguez came with her mother, who'd been released from the hospital just that morning, weak but determined to hear the music that had given her daughter strength during the darkest hours. Jessica Chen had returned too, but this time without her recorder. "Some moments aren't meant to be captured," she told Ezra. "They're meant to be lived." But it was the letter that had arrived that morning that truly humbled him. Written in careful cursive on official letterhead, it was from the Tennessee state capitol. Apparently word of the miracle music of Millbrook had reached the governor's office, and there was talk of declaring the farm a cultural landmark. The letter also mentioned a grant program for rural arts initiatives that could help Ezra save the farm and establish it permanently as a place of musical healing. As people began filing into the barn, Ezra felt the familiar mixture of nervousness and purpose that had become his constant companion. There was Robert Henley, his silver beard neatly trimmed for the occasion, carrying his fiddle case like a treasured artifact. The Morrison couple held hands as they found seats on one of the hay bales, their faces still bearing the quiet grief of recent loss, but also something that looked like hope. A group of teenagers from the local high school had come, kids who'd heard about the music on social media and convinced their parents to drive them out to the middle of nowhere on a school night. Their presence reminded Ezra that this wasn't just about healing old wounds. It was about showing young people that authentic expression still mattered in a world of manufactured everything. "Mr. Coleman," a soft voice behind him made him turn. A young woman he didn't recognize stood there, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled back and clothes that suggested she'd driven a long way to be here. "I'm Amanda Fisher," she said, extending a trembling hand. "I drove here from Memphis. 3 weeks ago, I was ready to give up on everything. I'd lost my job, my apartment felt like I had nothing left. Then I heard about your music online, and something about these stories. They made me believe that maybe broken things can still make beautiful sounds. Before Ezra could respond, Margaret appeared at his elbow. "It's time," she said gently. The barn had filled to capacity, maybe 60 people, which was perfect for the intimate space. As Ezra walked to the simple platform, the conversations gradually quieted. He settled onto the wooden stool Robert had crafted, positioned the banjo comfortably, and looked out at the gathered faces. They were waiting for magic, he realized, waiting for the same inexplicable connection that had reached across impossible distances that first night. The weight of their expectations should have been crushing, but instead Ezra felt something else settling around him, the same sense of purpose he'd discovered when Sarah used to listen from the porch swing. "I'm not sure I understand what happened 3 weeks ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet barn. "All I know is that music has always been how I talk to the world when regular words aren't enough. Tonight, I want to play for all of you who've shared your stories with me, who've reminded me that we're all just trying to find our way home." He started with a gentle melody, one his grandfather had taught him about rivers finding their way to the sea. But as his fingers found their rhythm, the music began to evolve, incorporating the stories he'd heard over the past weeks. There was Maria's grief for her grandson, Elena's worry for her mother, the young couple's fresh loss, Amanda's journey from despair to hope. The banjo seemed to understand what was needed. Each note carried the weight of authentic emotion, the kind that couldn't be manufactured or marketed. Around the barn, people began to sway slightly, some with tears streaming down their faces, others with expressions of profound peace. When other musicians began to join in, Robert's fiddle weaving harmonies, Danny's guitar adding gentle chords, Elena's voice rising in wordless melody, the barn filled with something that transcended the sum of its parts. It wasn't just music anymore. It was community healing itself through shared vulnerability and genuine connection. As the last notes faded into the Tennessee night, Ezra looked out at the faces surrounding him and finally understood what had happened that first magical evening. He hadn't played for the stars after all. He'd played for the people who needed to remember that beauty and connection were still possible, that authentic expression could still bridge any distance. The forgotten farmer had found his purpose, and in doing so he'd helped others find theirs too.